This is For Keeps, a podcast about collections and connections. I'm David Peterkowski. The famed writer Oscar Wilde once said the following about the allure and power of the theater. Quote, "I regard the theater as the greatest of all art forms, the most immediate way in which a human being can share with another the sense of what it is to be a human being." Unquote. Along those lines, we present this collector's story, a heartwarming tale that blends theater, humanity, music, and connection, not to mention tractors, hospital gowns, diesel engines, and bathroom fixtures. To help set the stage, so to speak, let's begin with a catchy show tune about appliances.
They've got features to talk about, features to remember.
General Electric, refrigerators and freezers.
The song you're hearing, a jaunty little number called Features to Talk About, is from a 1956 musical, but not a Broadway musical, or even the off-Broadway kind. This musical was produced by General Electric, and it's a prime example of what's known as the industrial musical, a little-known type of Broadway-style show that big-name corporations staged as entertainment at sales meetings and conventions, mostly from the 1950s to the 1980s. Behemoths of industry like Ford, Xerox, American Standard, Whirlpool Appliances, and American Hospital Supply, to name just a few, bankrolled full-on musicals. Many were as terrible as you might imagine, while others were surprisingly good. They not only entertained and motivated members of their respective industries, but they beat the drum for their brands and products in ways that brochures and team-building exercises could only hope to achieve. Within this musical theater parallel universe were some big names who occasionally lent their talents to the corporate shows. Performers such as Florence Henderson, Martin Short, and Chita Rivera appeared in industrial musicals, and music for some of them was written by revered Broadway composers, such as Sheldon Harnick and Jerry Bach, the writers of She Loves Me and Fiddler on the Roof, and the team of Kander and Ebb, who wrote Cabaret and Chicago. For decades, these shows remained largely hidden from the general public, with little known about them other than what was captured on record albums that were produced for the shows and given as gifts to those who attended the performances. But the strange world of industrial musicals began to gain visibility in the 1990s, when those records got the attention of Steve Young. Steve is a comedy writer based in New York, and he spent 25 years on the writing staff of David Letterman's 2 late-night talk shows. When Steve stumbled onto a bunch of industrial musical albums in secondhand stores, he brought the records to Letterman, who in turn got big laughs on TV when he played songs from shows such as the Detroit Diesel Corporation show Diesel Dazzle from 1966, or American Standard's 1969 oddity, The Bathrooms Are Coming. But for Steve, those laughs led to the start of an obsession. In addition to collecting albums for about 250 of the musicals, he's become a passionate evangelist for the genre, co-writing a book about them in 2013 and starring in the 2018 documentary Bathtubs Over Broadway, which follows Steve on his quest to find out all he can about these obscure shows, making friends with many of the performers and composers along the way, and bonding with some other unlikely industrial musical collectors, most notably punk rock musicians Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys and Don Bowles of the Germs. For Steve, collecting records and amassing a knowledge of musical theater were two things he never expected to happen.
I had no notion of being a record collector personally. I also grew up having no knowledge or understanding of musical theater, so I stumbled into this all very accidentally and sideways when I would have to gather material for the Letterman Show segment, Dave's Record Collection, which was finding real, unintentionally funny records that Dave could hold up on the show, and we'd play a little clip and he'd have a joke. So I was going to thrift shops, used record stores, any place I could get something that I thought we could get a laugh out of. And that's how I found the first few of these around New York City. I think probably performers from previous decades were cleaning out closets or whatever, and that's why there were some showing up in the stores in New York City. But that's where I found Diesel Dazzle and My Insurance Man, the first few of these, and I had no idea what I had stumbled onto. I assumed anything from a company convention must be speeches, but good heavens, it was musicals about selling and servicing diesel engines or selling insurance, and they were actually far from horrible. They were shockingly great in some ways. The subject matter seemed insane, and I was thrilled by that, but the music was really good.
Steve's musical theater knowledge improved considerably as he dove deeper into the realm of industrial musicals, but the learning process wasn't always the smoothest.
Some of my sad stories along the way relate to my shocking ignorance. One of the first ones I saw was a General Electric utility conference show with these power industry executives all seeing this musical about electricity and the electric power industry. And the writers, John Kander and Fred Ebb, and a guy named Walter Marks. Walter Marks, who I've since become friendly with, wrote the song I Gotta Be Me. He had some actual Broadway shows. Kander and Ebb, everybody in the Broadway world reveres those names. They wrote Cabaret in Chicago. I had no idea. I just thought, look at that. Some guys wrote songs about electricity. That's cute.
So you resisted the temptation to just kind of point, snicker, and move on.
That's exactly the arc of it. And that was detailed in David Whisenant's wonderful documentary, Bathtubs Over Broadway, where you sort of go into this world alongside me as I reconstruct my early days of laughing and pointing, what kind of losers would write a whole musical about tractors or fluorescent lights or whatever, and then the dawning realization, I think there were some actual genius-level talents involved here, and I'm very mystified and enthralled by this at some level, and I have to find out what's going on.
And did you initially have to sell Dave on the humor of these records at all?
You could usually find a pretty good clip and do all right, but I mean, just the idea of holding up a record. Here's the souvenir record album of the musical performed at the 1976 Exxon convention. The audience is already laughing, and then if you got a clip about the trials and tribulations of the beleaguered Exxon gas station owner and all the people who are messing up the bathrooms and your employees who do a bad job, you could usually get a solid laugh out of some of these.
1,000 tires a month you'll sell, and shortage a word you'll never hear. The washroom wreckers will be sent to hell, and no employee griping in your ear.
Especially like the bathrooms are coming. That was one of our favorites. The American Standard bathroom fixture musical. When you got songs about bathrooms, people are already most of the way there.
And as you listen to these, did you have a sense as to whether or not they were playing it straight, or were they trying to be funny in an ironic way?
Some of it is a weird gray area because you don't know what all the insider references were 50 years ago at this company. But yeah, they tried to put in humor that would resonate with this very specific audience of Coca-Cola bottlers or Plymouth dealers or whatever it was. And you can see generally where the humor is, but there's a great deal of sincerity also. And yes, maybe to the point of corniness, but the best of these shows were done by such good, smart, talented people that it actually kind of hangs together surprisingly well sometimes, even decades later, for someone who has never been on a tractor in his life or has never been inside a Coca-Cola bottling plant. It kind of still works.
Another surprising piece of Steve's odyssey is that he wasn't alone. Over time, as he began collecting the records, he encountered and befriended other collectors who shared his rather unique musical passion.
That emerged slowly. I don't know if it could have happened very well prior to the internet age, but I was starting to be in a little circle of people in the mid-90s, I guess on some early internet chat board or something, and people would swap cassettes of weird music, and that's how I think I first heard of the Bathrooms Are Coming, and somebody else said, oh, you should look out for this 7-Eleven convention record. So I started meeting people that way, and then someone else would say, oh, you know who has some of this stuff is Jello Biafra. Let me connect you to him. So suddenly I'm talking to Jello Biafra, and then I meet somebody at a flea market. That was Don Bowles, my other punk rock friend in California, who I met at the Rose Bowl flea market. So it is a much more primitive collector network 25 years ago, but we did get it going a little bit.
And people are coming at this for different reasons. I imagine the punk rock guys are more laughing at it.
It's interesting because I would say both Don Bowles and Jello Biafra, as much as they're attuned to the absurdity of consumer culture or the ravages of capitalism run or muck or whatever, they also have a great musical sense and responded to the talent behind these things. Like Don Bowles said he found Diesel Dazzle pretty early on, and it seems like something we're just going to laugh at. And then he listened to it and he went, what is going on? This is like primo stuff up and down the line. Everything is clicking here. How does that happen? So there is multiple levels to appreciate this while you're also kind of looking askance at it.
But of all the industrial musicals in Steve's collection, The Bathrooms Are Coming appears to be the high watermark, a specimen that, for a layperson audience, is flush with comedic potential. But for Steve, the show has given him much more than some easy jokes.
The Bathrooms Are Coming, the Souvenir album from 1969, it is kind of the perfect storm. Right away, the title tells you what you're getting into, and you're all kind of, oh my God, this is a musical about bathrooms. Look, there's a toilet on the cover. And then the cover itself is full of these wonderful pictures from the show, and it's got all these late 60s, eye-popping, semi-psychedelic graphics and bright colors, and then the vinyl itself is really well done. Some very talented people produced and arranged and got the whole thing recorded so well. So it kind of hits all the marks, and so it has its well-deserved place in the Pantheon.
My bathroom is much more than it may seem. Where I wash and where I cream, a special place where I can stay and cream and dream and dream and dream, dream.
And you have the added benefit of befriending the singer.
Yes, Pat, wonderful singer who sang My Bathroom in 1969, has enjoyed a great surprise chapter in later life where now she's beloved by a whole new generation of fans. And this has been great fun for me to see people like Pat, Sandy, who was also on the Bathrooms record, Hank Beebe, who I mentioned in his 90s now, the late Sid Siegel, all were shocked in a good way that I and these other collectors had looked into this and were caring about it and asking respectful questions about it and wanting to tell the world about it. And suddenly this whole endeavor that they had all understood to be something the public would never know or care about. Surprise, no, we're going to have a conversation about it and take your artistic merit seriously. So that's been a great thrill.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you that. Were you surprised at how willing the performers and the composers were to talk about this unusual chapter in their careers? No one seemed to be embarrassed by it or above it.
There was a range, but there was a lot of skepticism. When I would get in touch with somebody, they would be baffled. Sometimes people would actually say, okay, I know this is a practical joke. Who put you up to this? That actually happened a couple times. But the fact that I was somebody from the Letterman show also set off alarm bells in some people. They were sure that somehow I was coming to make fun of them. But it always happened that I was so full of enthusiasm and encyclopedic nerdy knowledge about all the work they'd done that they realized, I guess this guy's for real. And then they would loosen up, and then suddenly they're in their basement and attics pulling out stuff that I'd never heard of. And it's like Christmas morning. Oh my God, it's the 71 RCA show. Oh, hooray.
But it should come as no surprise, that not everyone shares Steve's love of these records and shows, and he's found that prejudices against these productions go way back.
There was a stigma to this stuff, though, back in the day. Hank Beebe has told me that he was called the king of the industrial shows, and it was meant as an insult. The people in the legitimate Broadway world definitely thought this was the embarrassing poor cousin of real artistic theater, and if you did industrials, you were just one of those people, and he's very surprised and gratified that he has outlived that and lived long enough to see the wheel turn. But I would say also some people who broke through to real household name status, Florence Henderson, Cheetah Rivera, Martin Short, they're all in the documentary Bathtubs Over Broadway talking about this. They are very happy to say, no, this was a terrific training ground. You worked with wonderful A-list talent up and down the line. You made good money. That was a huge part of it. Never forget that. This was a great paying gig. But they were not ashamed of it. And they were now famous enough they didn't have to worry about being pigeonholed like some of the people that never got to that level.
Uh-huh. So I want to get back to the music a little bit, and I have to admit I really enjoyed this song. I never enjoyed my Operation More, brought to us by the fine folks at American Hospital Supply.
We never enjoyed our Operation More. Every complication more, wearing our disposable gowns.
My converters.
Cutting is much easier.
And it's so much breezier.
Love those new disposable sheets.
What do you know about that show?
Oh, yeah, that's another show by Sid Siegel. This was a year or two before he wrote his towering achievement of The Bathrooms Are Coming, but he was doing industrials at a very steady clip, 60s, 70s, 80s, even into the 90s. He told me he did about 250 industrial shows. But the American Hospital Supply one, that's a scarce record. There were probably only a few hundred pressed. That was the case with most of these, just given out as souvenirs to people who'd been at the meeting or the convention. They were never in record stores. The public had no idea they existed. But that is an example of just some weird arcane product which you would not think would be a subject for a musical, but that was the craft of these people and the wit. Take what you think is absolutely not going to be a promising subject, in this case, disposable paper, hospital gowns, and surgical sheets and things like that, and make a relentlessly cheery, sort of macabre song about, if the patient gets bloody, real bloody, we'll just throw it away and get another one. And I never enjoyed my operation more. I loved my hysterectomy. I enjoyed my appendectomy. All this weird stuff that when people hear it now, they still go, what did I just hear? That can't be real. But it all was real. And it was meant humorously within its context. But it's still just so staggering that it happened.
Yes. And now I'm oddly comforted for my next medical appointment.
Yeah, well, it is a weird way to track social history and technology and business history. I know a fair amount about 100 companies that, as a comedy writer, why would I know about the history of Westinghouse or anything like that? I picked up all sorts of weird peripheral knowledge along the way, too.
Uh-huh. Kind of a bigger picture question. How do you explain the fact that these industrial musicals were so prevalent in the business world in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, and yet they were, at least as you described them in the film, kind of this secret or unknown world? I don't know that that could happen today with all of us interconnected 24/7. So how did it happen back then?
It was much easier to keep it under the radar in the old days. These shows were happening at a tremendous rate for decades, but if you weren't a salesperson or a distributor or whatever within these companies, you would have pretty much zero reason to ever know they existed. They were never publicized. Most of them, there were no souvenir records. I'd say it's very much the exception that anything was ever pressed on vinyl as a souvenir. And even if you were a Ford tractor dealer, you were in that bubble. You had no idea that there were shows for Pepsi or General Electric silicones. All these things were little silos, so separate from each other. Even the people who wrote this stuff, like Hank Beebe, he was shocked when the book that I wrote with my friend Sport Murphy came out a few years ago about about this. He had no idea that there were people like him in cities all around the country for decades doing this. Nobody knew what the big picture was. And nowadays, you're right. I don't think with everybody posting everything on Instagram every 20 seconds, you would not be able to keep this as quiet.
That's not to say the industrial musical is a lost art, at least not entirely.
There are modern versions of this, not as many, and not usually book musicals. But I think if you go online and look around, you'll find a lot of clips of entertainment at conventions.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if it's still going on and why it may have died out.
It was so expensive to write and produce and stage an original musical. You could do it on the cheap a little bit if it was song parodies, and many of the records in my collection do have song parody material, and usually you got away with just not even asking permission from the original composer. You just did it, and usually you got away with it. But for a while it was thrilling and new, like in the mid-50s when this stuff really came to life. I think it was kind of shocking for audiences to realize there's a whole musical about what I do every day at work, selling Pontiacs, and I'm kind of the hero of the show through this character up there who we all understand. But after a while, if everybody's seen this 10 times, it's not as new anymore. You had a new generation of people coming in who'd grown up on listening to the Beatles and then Led Zeppelin and on, and they were not as charmed by Broadway-style material. And that wheel has turned again. Now we have a generation of kids who are all very much up on Hamilton and the Book of Mormon and all that. But it fell out of fashion. It was expensive, and tastes changed, but it never goes away entirely. There will always be some combination of music, drama, the excitement of a live event, team building, sense of we're all in this together. That's going to fuel some version of this.
So I want to get back to the collecting angle of all this. As you added to your collection of records, didn't you find that after a while there was intense competition for some of the records you had tracked down on eBay?
My friend Sport, who I co-wrote Everything's Coming Up Profits with, he and I met because we were competing on eBay. And at the time, he just thought, who is this guy? And he figured out how to contact me and realized, oh, well, this is interesting. I guess I'm not the only one. And that was true of a few other people along the way. Don Bowles, Jello Biafra, Harry Shearer, lots of people who did not know for a long time that there were others out there like us. The competition on eBay never got too bad. There's still only usually a handful of people who really look for this stuff for years at a time, like I was, and my friend John Ward, who's in the documentary also. So there's still, though, a few rivals who sort of, in a friendly way, oh, did you see this on eBay? I wonder how much that'll go for. Luckily, I don't need that one, but I'm glad I'm not bidding on that. Look, oh, it went for $200. Oh. So, yeah, there is a certain amount of gossipy chit-chat, but any competition is generally very friendly. And when somebody finds something, they immediately dub it off and make digital copies of the music to send to the friends around in your circle. So everybody knows what everyone else has, pretty much.
Are you still collecting albums actively?
Yeah, I had a great run of a few years, late 90s, early 2000s. eBay had its first great glory days of America cleaning out its closets and attics. I was finding stuff every couple of weeks then. Nowadays, it's much slower. I can go for a better part of a year without seeing anything new that I really want. And suddenly the drought will end. In the last 3 weeks, I think I've gotten 3 records I'd never heard of before. For 25 years in, that's kind of surprising to me that there are still things out there that I had no idea of, but that's just the nature of it. If something was only pressed 200 copies for the salesman at the Hot Point Appliance Distributor Convention, chances are pretty good that we could go forever or nearly forever without knowing that this record existed. So that's going to keep happening.
And I have to ask the white whale question. Are there any that have eluded you, or you've been looking for them for years and years?
Oh, yeah. Well, the happiest ending story on that, in the documentary Bathtubs Over Broadway, I go visit Don Bowles in L.A., and he's got the one known copy of this record called Gould Growing. And this was another example of just how we are excited to share stuff with each other. When he found it years ago, he called me on the phone and said, I have to play this over the phone right now. And he started playing me the record. It was from the mid-'70s and had like a parody of The Hustle, but it was all about batteries and fuses.
Batteries that work in Alaska. Power stations built in Nebraska. Valves and seals are working in Kuwait. Get 'em there, we must, cause you can't wait. Electrical, industrial markets. These are both our corporate targets. We're that corporation you know as Gould.
And it was all about this company, Gould, and it was great and insane. And I said, man, I really want to find that. So 20 years go by and I never find it. But the documentary shows me talking about it with Don Bowles. And at one point I got a message from some guy in Illinois. He said, oh, that was a great movie. Hey, I have that record. And I said, you have Gould growing? That is the second confirmed copy in the world. He said, you don't have it? I said, no, I don't have it. He sent it to me. He said, you need it. I got to send it to you. So that was another example of the spirit that pervades all this collecting, I'm sure in every category, but it's certainly in this little subculture of these weird records. There are other ones out there I'm still looking for. There's one in the book called Astroline Challenge for Change. It's 1971 Brunswick bowling equipment. A show, a sales meeting, and it was like the space age, and there was a song about bowling in space. It's quite off-kilter in a great way. So I'm still looking for that. Who knows? I might find it tomorrow, or I might never find it. It's just so unpredictable.
Yeah, and it's amazing that the Gould record was just handed to you. It's very uncapitalistic.
Yeah, well, I was so moved. This guy, Angel, who took such pleasure and pride in giving me closure on this front. I sent him a copy of the book, Everything's Coming Up Profits, and a batch of the music. So everybody wins when that kind of collecting spirit is in play and everybody's helping each other out.
With a book and a documentary film under his belt, you might think that Steve has said all there is to say about the unusual shows he's collected. But those musicals that once showcased the big names of industry have turned into something resembling a cottage industry for Steve. So I know your enthusiasm, in an amusing bit of irony, has now led to you doing speaking engagements about the world of industrial musicals, and it's often for corporate audiences. Can you talk a bit about how that got started?
Yeah, I've done a couple things like that. Once the book came out a few years ago, and there was some nice attention around that. I was on NPR with Terry Gross. I was on the Letterman Show 3 times. There was a nice article in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. So I would get inquiries, and suddenly here I am in Chicago addressing a convention of the International Marketing Society, or I forget what it was now. That was a few years ago. And that was interesting. So people in this world really had no idea of what their forefathers and foremothers had done, because this was so just off the radar, as I was saying. So even within the business world, even in certain corporations that used to do this stuff, there's no institutional memory of it at all. And so it's very fun to reintroduce people to their own heritage sometimes. And then I do just general interest lectures and shows where I actually show the vintage film clips and explain my path into it. And when you have the actual 20-minute film of the bathrooms are coming, or the GE silicones, or Purina dog chow convention film or something, that stuff, I've curated some pretty high power craziness there, and those are fun evenings. It's like an hour and a half show that I do that stuff. And of course I had to not do that for a while, but I would love to do it again now that things are opening up again.
And you got to get that bowling in space music.
Oh, that's right. There's a few like that, and I almost don't want to mention too many of them because I don't need any more competition online. But yeah, there's a lot of records that are in my collection that I have the only known copy of, and some of my friends likewise have the only known copy of something. And they luck out on some, and I luck out on other ones. And hopefully everybody finds their own copy someday. But it is a very low stakes but entertaining little collecting world that we're in.
Uh-huh. And at one point there was talk of a fictional movie based on your book, I believe, and Will Ferrell was possibly going to star in it. Is that project moving forward at all?
I'm not sure how much I'm allowed to say, but yeah, the book rights were purchased, and there is something that is being worked on, and that's probably all I'll say about it. I have no idea whether it will ever come to fruition or not, but terrific people involved, and I am optimistic that something rather powerful and charming could yet come out of it.
So now that you're sitting pretty on top of the industrial musical world, have you ever thought about lobbying any of today's captains of industry to get them to make new musicals for the big corporations of today?
It does come up occasionally. Actually, the director of Bathtubs Over Broadway, David Letterman, and I at one point were invited to Chicago to screen the movie at a company's annual sales meeting as part of their get-together and festivities. And as part of that, without telling us, they prepared their own sort of mini industrial musical. They took some tunes from the pre-existing songs from the Bathrooms or Come Elsewhere and wrote new lyrics about their own company. And so suddenly Ava and I are in the audience at this sales convention seeing this weird meta version of an industrial show happening before our eyes. That was quite thrilling. I know that other companies still do them. There is an insurance company that I will not specify that seems to still do these extravaganzas every 2 or 3 years. They're probably about due for another one. I would love to get in and actually see one of these in my own lifetime. Don't know how I'll do it. I may have to buy a waiter uniform and try to slip in through the side door somewhere. But it may happen that this will be on the upswing. I don't know if you ever heard of the Skittles musical of a couple years ago. Early 2019, Super Bowl Sunday, instead of buying ad time on the Super Bowl, Skittles seems to have a very fun sense of humor in their marketing. They put on a one-time only actual musical in a New York City theater. The public could go to it, so it was not quite a real industrial in that sense, but it was very much feeling to me influenced by the book and the documentary and the new attention to this. And I was very lucky to get to go as a VIP, and I got a goodie bag with a souvenir vinyl record in it, which I think was a very limited pressing once again. So I feel like there is awareness of this that there wasn't even a few years ago, and it may have cycled back around.
Yes, well, if anyone outside the Skittles universe should be aware of this, it should be you, I think.
Yeah.
I was thinking maybe Elon Musk could bankroll a Tesla musical.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure that places like that are constantly trying to figure out how can we get people excited at our next meeting. I have done a couple other corporate gigs writing comedy for events and meetings. They do not mostly seem to have scaled all the way up to the musicals yet, but we may get there.
Yes. Uber the musical. I like that.
Yeah. It sounds like a joke, and then a year from now it won't be a joke.
So I've got one last question for you. For you personally, what's been the biggest revelation or surprise from all this? The fact that these musicals existed, the fact that you liked them, or the fact that they've led you to making new friends and starring in a movie, or maybe it's all of the above. What's kind of your biggest takeaway? It
is all of the above, but to me, I think the lesson that you learn in the movie so powerfully, and David Letterman, the director, won so many awards for this movie because it goes in such directions you don't see coming. But I started as a sort of cynical, cocky 20-something guy working at this famous TV show in New York City, and I thought I could look down my nose at people who are doing this weird, shadowy corporate work. And turns out, well, if you look closer and actually pay attention, you might find you're humbled by the talent and decency and humanity and every good quality of the people who do so many kinds of work you don't know about. And at the end of the movie, I say, yes, I'm so glad that I've helped other people find some recognition. But for me, it's just opened me up to being more receptive to my fellow man. And now I walk down the street and I look at some older guy and my eyes might have slid right past him ordinarily, but now I think that guy might be the best in the world at something I don't know about. We're surrounded by these people who are great in ways that we can't fathom. And so that's a lesson that you keep it in your mind every minute of every day maybe, but it shouldn't be too far away from you. So aside from the joy of the people I've met and the crazy songs that are stuck in my head, and the movie was a wonderful experience, and so many other great things, that I think is the most profound personal lesson from me, is just don't make these snap judgments because you have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it works on a lot of levels. You can laugh at the songs about bathrooms and tractors, or you can find something deeper.
you can do both. That's the joy of it for me. I'm still laughing at some of this stuff. And then I think, and I know the people who wrote it and sang it, and I love them, and they love me, and it's all swirled together in the most multicolored, multifaceted way I could have imagined.
Uh-huh. Well, Steve, that's everything I've got for you. I want to thank you not only for your time, but for evangelizing the lost and now rediscovered world of industrial musicals. And what started out as a joke seems to have given you some very real joy.
And thank you for helping to bring collectors and collections to light. I found that this was wonderful for collectors of all sorts of things who all want to make other people understand we're not hoarders. We want to share things. We want to get people excited about what we see. And when we do that, we're making our lives better and other people's lives better. And we're not just being sweaty and antisocial in a basement, just being a miser or something. So collecting is an outward-looking thing when it's done right, I think. And so I thank you for finding so many great examples of that.
I appreciate that.
All right. My pleasure, David. Thank you for taking an interest.
You bet.
You've collected me now.
And I'm not letting you go, sorry.
All right. Very good.
Take care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, the joy that Steve Young has found in the quirky world of industrial musicals is the gift that keeps on giving, most notably through the documentary Bathtubs Over Broadway, which won a bunch of film festival awards upon its release in 2018. Following Steve's quarter-century as a writer for David Letterman, his work collecting and chronicling industrial musicals makes for a touching second act of sorts, not only for himself, but for the musicals and the entertainers he's grown to love. For Keeps is a production of me, David Peterkovsky. My thanks to Steve Young for sharing the remarkable story of industrial musicals and his own remarkable journey from a non-believer to a collector and the genre's biggest cheerleader. At forkeepspodcast.com, you'll find photos of Steve and some of his records that capture this unique and multifaceted wrinkle in the history of musical theater. There's also a link to Steve's website, industrialmusicals.com, which includes sound clips from other shows and a trailer for the film Bathtubs Over Broadway. The show's theme song is by Still Flyin, and the closing theme is by Eric Frisch. Additional music for this episode was generously provided by Aaron Kenny, Blue Dot Sessions, and Serge Quadrado. You can visit the show online at forkeepspodcast.com or follow For Keeps on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at For Keeps Podcast. Thanks for listening to For Keeps. Until next time, keep on keeping on.